hired early. There's a whole story that we know behind the labor issues nationally. Well, Alaska is not immune to that as well. So we're having difficulty filling some of our slots. As you know, last couple of years we've been adding money into signing bonuses for correction officers, for our state troopers. We've seen increases for our lawyers in the Department of Law. Across the board, there's labor issues, not just in state government, but in the private sector. I was glad to see the commission recommend raises for our commissioners because they're tough to fill, they're tough to find. And given what's happening in the labor market, I want to do everything I can to keep our people in place so that we can keep operational integrity of the executive moving forward. So when the commission came out with a report early this year that they were still recommending money, they're still recommending raises for the executive, they were silent on the legislature. I had discussions with legislative leadership on this because the legislative leadership, in the discussions I had with them, they were wondering why the commission did not put raises in there for them. So I had staff contact members of the commission, and the reply that we got was, and it's in the report, there's actual reports online, and I'll actually read the statement in the report. And this is the one that came out in January. So it says, no recommendations are being submitted for the legislature as the commission believes further discussion is necessary. So I had a discussion with legislative leadership. They gave me some ideas. One of the ideas is the one that the commission actually adopted, the new commission that we appointed. And they got that recommendation, and they voted on the recommendation. That recommendation, as well as executive increases, and that's what you see before you today. That's what the legislature is debating. We don't know what the outcomes will be, but the public process is you appoint individuals to this commission. They look at different options or issues regarding salary. They make their recommendation. They made a recommendation the past 2 years for the executive to have an increase in pay. They worked last year on the issues, for example, of per diem in pay, as we remember. This year they were silent on that, as they stated in their recommendation paper they gave to the legislature and to the executive. And then the discussions ensued. What about the legislature? Recommendations were given to us. We passed them on to the commission. Commission made their decision. Now that goes back to the legislature. Legislature will make a decision whether they want to do veto overrides on the bill that I vetoed, whether they want to accept in some form or another the commission's recommendations. But in the end, it's the legislature will make the final decision, and that public process, this is just the beginning of that public process, as we know. So that's on the commission and the suggested salary increases. Next issue we'll go to is, and we're going to open this up for questions, so don't worry, we'll get back to you guys. The PFD. So now we have three approaches to the PFD. We have a full PFD statute request by myself that we submit with our budget. We have discussions coming out of the Senate, and we'll know sooner or later if it's going to be a 75-25, if it's going to be a 50-50. We saw what the House has done as a 50-50. Like I've always said, I believe that we should do everything we can to keep as much money in the hands of the people. Many others believe that we've got to take a look at the PFD in order to help balance the budget. So those discussions will ensue. So you've got three different approaches to the PFD. Again, to be fair to the Senate, their final version of what they're going to do has not really been submitted yet. But we anticipate that they will. We anticipate that it'll either be, I doubt it's going to be the full statutory. It could be a 50-50, it could be a 75-25. And we'll continue to have the discussions as to what that's going to look like in the end. In the end, it's the legislature appropriates. So we'll see what that number lands on. Another issue that's coming up is broad-based taxes. For years, many of you have asked me, what about revenue measures? And because of the instability of just relying on oil, and we'll talk about that here in a moment too. And so Alaska being a resource state, and just my personal philosophy, once again, that we should keep as much money in the hands of people, had us thinking what we could do to maximize our resources. As we know, Alaska, and I'll just be blunt, is under attack by NGOs, by, in some cases, extreme environmentalists, and by our own administration. We have 48 actions by this administration against Alaska, which is limiting our ability to capitalize on our resources, which is limiting our ability to be able to produce revenue and wealth for the state of Alaska. However, we were approached by the private sector about a year and a half ago that we may have an opportunity in not just our forests to monetize our forests, but also in our basins in Cook Inlet and up on the slope. And a third potential is our mariculture industry that some of those leases could be leased by individuals or companies that want to grow kelp for the purpose of sequestering carbon. So as we know, carbon has become an issue for many people in the world. We've been approached by outfits that want to monetize carbon in Alaska, both in our trees, our forests, both in our basins, and also to a lesser extent at this stage of the game, off of our coasts. I'm going to do anything and everything I can to monetize our resources to the benefit of Alaskans. We believe that this approach to carbon, and I want to thank the legislature for hearing the bills, and I hope they do get the bills passed, because what the bills will simply do is enable us to have conversations with entities that deal with carbon, deal with better forest management. I mean, for example, and I've talked to people about this, we'll be asking for money from the legislature to pay for the fires that we fight every year in the state of Alaska. So Alaska has viewed its forest in many respects over the years as kind of a let it be, let nature take its course. The problem with that is we burn anywhere from 1 million to 4 million acres a year. We have to help put those fires out, especially when they're near residential areas or infrastructure, and it costs us money. Last year, we made a little over $1 million on our forests, our timber industry. And I think all of us know we can do a lot better than that. We can manage the forest better. We can get rid of beetle kill. We can replant. We can actually start, I think, a pretty robust interior timber industry and lumbering industry as well with our white spruce. So I'm looking forward to the day here pretty quick where these bills come out, and then we can see how serious outfits are from across the world with regard to doing business in Alaska. And again, I know there are some people that think this is some type of approach that may alter the character of Alaska. I don't think it is. I think if we're able to monetize our forests and our basins to the benefit of Alaska, I think it's going to help a lot with regard to increased revenue to help underwrite the budgets of Alaska. Broad-based taxes, there's always folks talking about broad-based taxes. We do have broad-based taxes in place now, especially with our resource industry. There's always going to be discussions, and there is discussions occurring now on should those broad-based taxes be tweaked. Again, what I've told folks is I'm interested in a comprehensive approach to the budget. This idea of wrestling and fighting over one component every year to the detriment of all of the other legislative priorities that we have is a bad idea for Alaska. And so you're going to be hearing more and more discussions about coming up with a broad fiscal plan. A couple of years ago, there was a fiscal policy group that was put together, first to deal with the PFD, but then to look at things like spending limits. Where can we get other revenue? And this is one of the reasons why I was glad that we had the opportunity to talk about carbon. But in the end, I think we owe it to Alaskans to really take a look at how we could bring finality and stability to Alaska through our fiscal approaches. In a moment, you're going to get details on the spring forecasts. For fall 23, the FY23 forecast is down from the fall from about $246 million less. And then our FY24 forecast is down approximately $680 million from the forecasts. And then, of course, the question will always come up, what about vetoes, Governor? Are you going to contemplate vetoes? The power of veto is pretty explicit in the Constitution, and if you look at the conversations that the framers of the Constitution had when they were putting the Constitution together, they wanted a very strong executive. Alaska has the strongest executive branch by Constitution in the country, and so I have exercised my veto power in the past. I will continue to use it in the future if we need to make sure that we get the budget within a range that's acceptable to the legislature and the people of Alaska. But those discussions are going to be ongoing because right now, like I said, the House is rolling out their concept on what the budget should look like. The Senate is in that process as well. We've laid down what we want the budget to look like in December, and now the negotiations will ensue in earnest. I have no doubt that we'll come up with a budget. I have no doubt that there will be areas that some people will not get what they want, some organizations, some branches of government, some departments in my own executive will not get what they want or hoped for. But in the end, that's just the way this system this works and the way this system is designed. So before we go to questions, what I'd ask is for Commissioner Designee Adam Crum to come forward and just give a little bit more detail on the spring forecast and the fall forecast issue.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you guys all for joining us here today. So the time has come for our spring forecast, and pretty much the only certainty around our spring revenue forecast are that global events will transpire. In 2021, it was a Delta wave. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And in 2023, it's fears of a global banking crisis. Last week saw a significant decline in oil prices due to concerns about the potential for a new financial crisis and recession, which would reduce oil demand. As bank stabilization measures have been put into place, concerns about a recession have eased and oil prices are beginning to recover. But that being said, our goal in this administration is to provide transparent numbers using consistent methodology. Our Tax Division and Economic Research Group, or ERG, have utilized the same methodology for the previous few years, and the revenue forecast incorporates the most current indications from financial markets and is based on an annual average Alaska North Slope, or ANS, oil price of $85.25 per barrel for FY23 and $73 per barrel for FY 2024. Driven by this lower outlook for oil price and production, the Unrestricted General Fund, or UGF, revenue forecast, before accounting for the transfer from the permanent fund, has been reduced by $246 million for FY23 and $679 million for FY24. This in turn makes the UGF revenue, before accounting for the PMV transfer, forecasted to be $3.6 billion for FY23 and $2.7 billion for FY24. The permanent fund is expected to transfer $3.4 billion to the general fund for FY23 and $3.5 billion for FY24. These amounts include funds that are available for general government spending and the payment of dividends to Alaskans. It's worth noting that the long-term factors still point to increasing oil prices, but this is something that we want to make sure we're always sharing the current information that we have as a state. So we're going to continue to work on this. We are presenting these numbers again to the legislature tomorrow when both finance committees were given a spring forecast, and our team of economists are going to share the information along with a lot of the assumptions based around these numbers. Thank you.
I just want to hang close because we're going to open up for questions now. Jeff?
Are we going to start online with Becky Bohr from the Associated Press?
Thanks. Governor, in your State of the State speech, you said, we've been told by some that we can generate as much as $30 billion or more over 20 years just from our forest lands related to the carbon issue. I haven't heard those kinds of numbers used in any of the committees. DNR seems quite cautious when making any sort of estimates or predictions. How confident are you in that? And at this point, in terms of additional revenue, are you putting your eggs in that carbon basket, or do you think, and would you recommend that lawmakers look at other sorts of revenue to help supplement our traditional sources?
Thanks for the question, Becky. So I don't have to urge the legislature to look at different revenues. A lot of the legislators do that on a consistent basis, and that'll continue with those discussions. Again, I was asked many times, and it is the responsibility to a great degree for the governor to find ways to produce more income for the state of Alaska, especially in our state, which is a resource state. With regard to the numbers and the potential for carbon, some have told me, as crazy as it may sound to some have told me that those figures I initially gave of billions It might be more. It all depends on what's going to happen in the world markets, but it also depends upon how we approach it once this enabling language that the legislature is working on hopefully is passed soon. We'll then know. There's different ways to approach this. So, for example, we're moving a pipeline concept forward that we hope ends up with an actual finance pipeline to get gas from the slope. A lot of those discussions entail sequestering of carbon because of the process, our cycling of gas, our CO2 in some of the North Slope gas, the ability to produce ammonia, hydrogen, et cetera. Those discussions are happening in earnest. And those discussions alone, just in the tax credit aspect of that project, coming from the federal government is tremendous. It's in the billions of dollars that could assist with this process. Sequestering carbon in and of itself is a discussion, for example, that our friends in Japan were having with us and continue to have with that. Again, the coastal concept of growing kelp for the purpose of sequestering carbon, but also potentially for animal feed, which would fit into our food security approach that we're taking here in Alaska, is also an issue. So I would say that I don't blame the legislature for being cautious. These are figures that have been proposed to the executive, but like anything else, until you see it, until you see actual proposals that encompass the details, that's a good question. But I would say this, from what we're seeing and what we saw beginning in 2015 with our native corporations and what we see in the lower 48 that's happening and what we're seeing across Europe that's happening, given the fact that our forest under state control, the acreage is astronomical. No other state comes close. We're talking 43 to 45 million acres of interior forest and some of the forest lands associated with the Tongass forest, our state part of that forest. So we won't know the exact amounts. And as a matter of fact, Becky, it depends greatly on the approach, on how we contract for acreage and what's involved in those contracts. But I would say this: right now, if you do a certain math where we're going to be asking for approximately $60 million to fight fires, and we made a little bit more than $1 million last year, that means that we're $59 million in the hole on our forests. It could be viewed in that respect. Anything that gets us making money in our forests, anything that keeps our forests healthy, anything that helps us make money by sequestering carbon in our basins, or carbon off our coast, any of that is plus money. It's a revenue source that we have not really tapped into. So I'm just going off of what was proposed to us by a couple of outfits, which spurred this larger discussion on getting enabling language. So we'll have to see, but I'm confident that we can realize significant revenue for the state of Alaska.
All right, next we'll go to Jeff Landfield with the Alaska Landmine.
Hi, Governor. I want to ask about the salary commission. You mentioned the public process. So last Monday, Kurt Olson, the chair, resigned. The week prior, Lee Cruz resigned to take a job in the Department of Revenue. And then on Tuesday, you summarily removed 3 other members and appointed 5 new members for a meeting that was the next day. And they held a 15-minute meeting to elect a chair, waive the 20-day requirement, and raise legislator pay. How is that a good public process?
Because that's just the beginning of the process, Jeff. We knew that the commission, the previous commission members, and this commission was interested in increasing salaries for the executive. The question really was, what about salaries for the legislature? As I said earlier in the press conference, we had that discussion with legislative leadership. They gave us a figure and asked us to send it on to the commission for them to consider. The commission considered that, voted on it. Now it's back in the hands of the legislature for the legislature to decide if they want to accept that recommendation, if they want to introduce a bill to change anything, if they want to override the veto of the bill that I vetoed yesterday. That is the major part of the public process. And so the public process really takes place within the legislative body. As I mentioned earlier, a commission was formed in the 80s. Prior to that, it was the legislature that dealt with their own their own salaries as well as the executive. And so the public process is unfolding the way it should, in my opinion. It's happening right now.
Right, next we'll go to Mark Sabatini with the Juneau Empire.
Thank you. Governor, your budget in December had a $250 million projected deficit. That has gone to roughly $400 million. Other lawmakers have quoted a higher figure for that. Now you have a revenue forecast that's $679 million lower than originally projected. My question is, with the size of that deficit, are you comfortable having that covered with a constitutional budget reserve draw? And if not, what approaches would you see in terms of revenue cuts or anything else? What would you personally want to alter to come out with a budget that balances, so to speak?
Yeah, good question. So we have about $2 billion in the CBR, and we've always had the belief that the CBR would be a discussion in the budgets going forward. So you're going to see, and I think it was alluded to in some of the press conferences today, I think by Senator Stedman, but that discussion is going to occur. How do we balance the budget? What are all the tools that we have? The CBR is one. The reductions in vetoes are another part of the tool. So you're gonna see those discussions involving all of these tools. There'll be people that will talk about revenues. There's no doubt about it. And so the real process of hammering out this budget kind of begins now. Again, we introduced a executive budget in December. The House has been working on their budget. The Senate has been working on budgets too. But you're going to see, I think, other ideas rolled out, and you're starting to see that happen. And so, again, we're all going to have to come together. It's a very diverse legislature. Branches of government have been separated for a specific reason for over 246 years, so we have checks and balances. But there's also the processes are in place to have those discussions to come up with a budget. We always come up with a budget. The question is, how contentious is that process? When does that occur, et cetera? I think everybody in Juneau, from whom I've talked to, they want to get this budget done sooner than later so that there's certainty for programs, services, employees, et cetera. So I have no doubt we'll hammer out a budget. What that looks like over the next couple of weeks, we'll get that figured out.
Next, we'll go
Several weeks.
Next, we'll go to Greg Knight with KNOM.
Thank you, Governor. What parts of your budget can you highlight that could have a market effect, a good effect for or benefit for Western Alaska? And if you can get into specifics, the rural villages and the coastal parts of the region.
So public safety, which we've been focused on the last several years, continues to be part of our focus. We've put down a request for approximately $58 million to do a teacher recruitment incentive approach to keeping teachers, recruiting them and keeping them. We're asking that we do that for 3 years so we can do a study to see if that has an actual impact. And many of our western and northern coastal communities and school districts, as well as our interior school districts, our remote school districts, oftentimes they suffer from the highest amount of turnover and difficulty retaining. So that is a significant chunk of change to try and change that approach. When I first came to Alaska and went out and got a job as a teacher back in the early 80s, there was about 700 openings back then. Alaska's always been plagued somewhat by turnover, recruitment, retention. We believe that this could be a game changer. We're having a teacher recruitment retention issue across the country, not just here in the state of Alaska. And so that proposal came as a result of research, discussions with others across the country, my own personal experience in rural Alaska and urban Alaska. And so that in and of itself would have, I think, a significant impact on rural Alaska. The READS Act, I believe, will have a significant impact on rural Alaska in terms of performance, and hopefully we'll see those outcomes improve here over the next several years. We are stabilizing the ferry system. This is coastal Alaska, but it goes out west to the chain as well. We'll continue with those discussions. But I would say public safety, education, we're working on doing our best to get as close to possible in eradicating TB, which often impacts rural Alaska. So there's a number of things we're doing. The rural Alaska figures prominently in all of our discussions and all of our approaches for Alaska as a whole.
Next, we'll go to Margie Bowman with the Cordova Times.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is more of a general question. Alaska, like other states, is experiencing a worker shortage. And I'd like the governor to say, how much of a concern is it to you that the number of people leaving the state for a variety of reasons, including work elsewhere? And how important do you think the quality of public education in Alaska is to attracting workers with families to move here? And what role does the basic amount per student from the state play in this? Thank you.
Thanks, Margie. So, certainly concerned with turnover and the ability to recruit people. This is one of the reasons why we put in signing bonuses for our Department of Public Safety, corrections officers, why we put in raises for those in our Department of Law, why we've negotiated raises and contracts for all of our employees. It certainly is because we're in a competitive world right now for labor. COVID kind of upended the world, and that includes not just supply chains, but labor as well. So we're going to be in competition. We're going to be in competition basically for people to live in the state of Alaska, people to work in the state of Alaska. Our population is leveled off and is actually dropping in terms of our birth rates and immigration to the state. And this should be a really an important discussion that we have going forward. What do we want Alaska to look like? Are we going to design Alaska for a shrinking Alaska population-wise, which would mean smaller schools, smaller workforce, smaller output? I said in my State of the State, I want to make us the most pro-life state in the country. And what I meant by that, and I'll reiterate, is we want to get as many people to Alaska as possible. This is a big, big, big state, small population. But the economic systems, Margie, that we've operated under for some would say over 100 to 200 years is predicated upon growth. It's predicated upon more people, I'm going to say it again, more people, and that's babies being born, people moving to the state, and people staying in the state. More people demanding more goods and services. More people in the state, especially young people, mean more people in our schools. More, again, demand across the economy. And so it is a concern. It's a concern that we should all be thinking about. You look at companies like Japan, you look at, countries like Japan, countries like Korea, European countries, their populations are dropping. It's a steep decline. And those concerns have been highlighted by the leaders of those countries as well. And so it's a discussion we need to have. I know there are some people that don't want to have, quote, a lot of people in Alaska. My reply to that is you really want to see as many young people as possible. You want to see as many kids as possible. You want to see as many folks here as possible because that's what's going to drive the economy. That's what's going to make Alaska a vibrant place to live. And that's going to really give us a future. But if we're just going to manage for decline, I think we're going to have a long-term problem that's going to be detrimental to the state.
All right, next we'll go to Sean McGuire with the Anchorage Daily News.
Hi, thanks very much. This might be a question for Commissioner Crum, but I was wondering if Lee Cruz was hired by the Department of Revenue to get him off the Alaska State Officers Compensation Commission.
No, I'll answer that question. No, that wasn't the reason at all. He was hired because of his competence, but I will let the commissioner chime in.
No, thanks for that question. To be honest, up until a week ago, I think myself, like most Alaskans, did not know what the Salary Compensation Committee was. And so this is this was an individual, we were looking for a job he applied for, and he hit the specs we were looking at, and so therefore I brought him on board.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Governor, did his resignation precipitate then your later action to remove the other 3 commissioners?
No, Sean, it's a combination of 2 things. One is we're reviewing all of our boards and commission. This is a second term. So we're reviewing a lot of our boards and commissions. They have 3-year terms. Regents, for example, at the university have 8-year terms. Some boards and commissions, they could be removed at any time, replaced at any time. But no, that's an executive decision that's actually based on the Constitution and law on how we can operate with our boards and commissions. So I know that some want to believe that there's some nefarious or dark reason why the members of the commission were removed. But again, as I explained earlier, all statute, Constitution, regs, you name it, were fouled, have been fouled, will be fouled. And as far as the public process goes, that begins with the commission, but in the end, it ends with the legislature where these compensation concepts now lie. And so, no, there was no nefarious, no wheel and deal, whatever some may want to imply.
Right, next, we have Jack Barnwell with the Fairbanks Daily News Miner.
Hi, Governor. There's been strong talk about an increase in the base student allocation. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that. There's 2 bills in the House, one requesting an increase by $1,000, the other by $1,250.
Yeah, so I haven't heard of a legislature that does not believe that there needs to be discussion on increasing funding for education. What that's going to look like in the end, what form that takes, how much, where is that money going to be placed, how it's going to be emphasized. Again, now that the House is kind of rolling out their version of the budget, and we've got bills being heard over the next several weeks, we'll be able to figure that out. We'll be able to figure out how much, again, where it's going to go, in what form. So that's difficult to answer at this point, but I think the consensus is that there will be money put into education. How much, that'll be determined here in the future.
All right, next, we have James Brooks with the Alaska Beacon.
Hi there. I see we have Neil Steininger on the call. Could I ask a technical question to him before a question of the governor?
I'm sure. Go ahead, James.
Neil, what's under the current new revenue forecast? What's the size of the deficit in the FY23 budget and under the proposed House FY24 budget?
Hi, James. So under the fiscal year 20, we have a $220 million deficit with this new revenue forecast. Under the governor's fiscal year 24 budget, we have about a $917 million deficit under this new forecast.
Thanks. And for the governor, talked to all the caucuses today, and there seems to be agreement on using the CBR to fill the FY23 budget in the fast track bill. Any problems with that you see?
No, James, not when it comes to the CBR. Again, we've assumed that would be a part of the conversation going forward. Again, here's the issue that unfortunately bedevils Alaska is somebody asked me, we were talking about this earlier, what can you predict the price of oil is going to be? I'm pretty certain, it's going to sound silly, but I'm pretty certain it's going to fall anywhere between a negative $10 a barrel and $160 a barrel. I think if somebody wants to take me up on a bet on that, I'll take that. But the point I'm trying to make is it's volatile. We don't know. And so, again, we want to come up with, I think, a complete fiscal approach for the future so we don't have to go through every year wrestling over an issue on the permanent fund or wrestling over an issue on a spending limit or wrestling over an issue on the CBR, the SBR. But yes, we anticipated that the CBR would be part of the discussion going forward.
All right, now in the room, we have Iris Samuels with the Anchorage Daily News.
Governor, I had another question on the public process, but this time I wanted to ask about the resolution that was passed by the state education board. That resolution had to do with the participation of transgender students in school sports. And there's been some concern raised by some legislators that there just wasn't enough public process and an ability for the public to comment on that resolution before it was passed. And also that the legislative committees charged with handling education weren't notified about that resolution ahead of time. So I'm hoping you can comment on if you think that public process was a good one, and if you think that that's a sort of a way for the education board to act moving forward on resolutions.
Yeah, I think it's proper for them to move on resolutions. That's part of their process and do it in a public fashion. That resolution, I believe, was intended for the Alaska Association of School Activities to also take a look at. They'll have a public process. So I guess maybe the question could be, should the school board check with the committees? They can. I mean, they can do that, but at the same time, that's not something that is, I believe, in statute or in the Constitution. However, I would urge as much discussion as possible. And these are issues that a lot of folks are having discussions on right now. And so the school board's having a discussion on it. They passed the resolution. There'll be other actions by the state school board, just like there is with local school boards, just like there's going to be with our committees in the legislature. So when a board or commission starts a process, oftentimes that's the beginning, not the end of a process. And so those discussions ensue within the legislature or other associated bodies with these boards and commissions. So no, I think they acted appropriately and within their parameters to make a statement on this particular issue.
All right, next we have Elena Sims with Alaska's News Source.
We've just heard about UGF revenue forecast decreases and the latest projections for oil prices. Can you elaborate on what this could mean for near-term legislative goals and program spending?
Those discussions have been occurring. Those discussions will increase and become more focused over the next several weeks as to what people want to keep in the budget, how people want to pay for the budgets, what we want to look at going forward on the budgets. And so you're going to get more and more, I think, of a focused discussion. And then you'll see things move in and out of budgets before the budgets are solidified. So again, to tell you what it's going to look like and how much of a draw on the existing savings and revenue sources that will take, that's difficult to answer, but in the end, we'll get something that the legislature can agree on and that the executive can agree on. And again, if there needs to be a look at vetoes, we've done that, I think, every year. We've looked at that as well. We'll continue to look at that. So it's tough to predict what that's going to look like, but it will be a budget. The hope is, the consensus is that we get it done sooner than later. So once again, that the public knows what the budget, final budget is going to be.
Lastly, we have Nat Hertz.
Hi guys. I have.
Is it a 1E, a 2E, a 3? No, how many?
Start with half dozen and negotiate downward. Okay. So I actually had just a quick question for the revenue commissioner and a substantive question for the governor. For the revenue commissioner, I'm wondering if you can speak to now that the Willow project has been approved by the Biden administration, are the revenue reductions based on Conoco's investment in that project incorporated into this year's revenue forecast? If they're not, what would you guys expect as the general fund reduction in current and then subsequent 2 fiscal years?
Excellent question. Yes. So the Willow project has been incorporated into this over the next couple of years. It's on our what's called a risk-based projection. Depends upon the amount of potential spend that they have versus the year upon which production will occur, and putting all of our overall tax structure into play. What I will say about the overall numbers is we actually are presenting on Thursday to the Senate Finance as well as House Finance. The Division of Tax and the ERG group are going to be presenting, along with Department of Natural Resources, an overall updated fiscal analysis of the Willow project about what we're seeing on the overall timelines based upon current legal actions, as well as using these updated spring forecast numbers on what that looks like to the state. And so it'll be a very robust conversation on Thursday. So if you're curious about that, I would say tune in.
Thanks. And then for the governor, there are now a couple of bills on renewable portfolio standards that have been introduced separately in the House and the Senate. And that was legislation that you introduced last year. And I'm curious from your perspective, like, have you given up on that as far as like a personal priority of yours, or is that something you would expect to put some political capital into pushing through the legislative process this year?
Yeah, great question. To answer that, I think what you're going to see are discussions now ensuing between an RPS and a CES. CES being a clean energy standard, and if people are trying to figure out what the difference is, I'll simplify it, although there are variations. An RPS is a renewable portfolio standard for utilities and for the state of Alaska to kind of, these are aspirational and sometimes goals that are fixed by statute. So in an RPS, you're really looking at things like solar and wind, hydro to some extent. In a CES, clean energy standard, you would have those potential energy generation approaches, but you could also have carbon capture for like coal and nuclear. So those are two of the obvious ones that are left out of an RPS. I think it bodes well for Alaska to have as much and as many potential generators of electricity in the state of Alaska to lower the cost. And so I think you're going to see a robust discussion coming out of the House and the Senate on, I think it's going to probably start to morph more into a CES, which I think gives Alaska a little bit more flexibility. I think it's a priority amongst some of the legislators. And so my priority, getting at is we'll probably have more discussions on the task force we put together for energy, because that's really designing what does Alaska look like. Again, and I don't want to belabor this, but it's a big state. Coastal Alaska in many places has the benefit of hydro. Aleutians, Western Alaska, Northern Alaska, other parts of Alaska has benefits of consistent wind for wind. Ironically, even solar works in Alaska, maybe for part of the year, but nonetheless, that can offset costs. And so in answer to your question, the main priority for me is what the task force comes up with, because I think that will get you policy items that we'll be able to hang our hat on and move forward on. So is that it? Okay, so thanks folks. But again, I will just go down and reiterate a couple of things here. The compensation question always comes up. It's always politically charged. It's just the nature of it. And now the discussions will begin in robust with the legislature as to what they want to accept. Questions have come up about labor, about retention, recruitment. Not just Alaska, not just state government or the private sector in Alaska, but across this country, there are labor issues. There are retention issues of labor. There's recruitment issues of labor. And so we've worked on some of this with some of the approaches that we outlined earlier. Somebody said to me, what do you want Alaska to look like specifically in terms of the makeup of politicians, of governors, of cabinet members, of legislators? We do have to ask ourselves the question, do we want a situation, and some may, which is a legitimate perspective, do we want to have as low as pay possible for, let's say, legislators? If you do, you just have to be prepared for who can then run for those positions. If you look at a state maybe like New Hampshire, your neck of the woods, Nat, right? You were from Maine, but nonetheless, in a much smaller state, oftentimes your legislators, they drive to the Capitol, they conduct their business in the day, and they go home at night. Some of them are farmers, some of them are business owners. The question for Alaska is, I think you want to take an approach where you want as many, a pool drawn from as many of the, quote, average Alaskans as possible. You want to be careful you don't turn this into an aristocracy where only those with incredible wealth can afford to spend time in Juneau or spend time doing some of these other jobs. And so it's always going to be a politically charged discussion. Again, the process right now, it's in the hands of the legislature, really always has been. And they'll make the determination as to where they want to go with this. Our forecasts in oil, we're the only state where we could stand here one day. I mean, in my tenure as governor, I've seen negative $3 a barrel oil. I've seen oil over 130 some dollars a barrel. We're going to have to continue to have a discussion. I hope that discussion becomes more serious about putting together a sustainable plan that goes forward that would serve Alaska well. And with regard to the budget, all tools are on the table to look at. Vetoes are on the table to look at. draws on the CBR on the table to look at, other types of approaches to revenue. But I would say this. If we continue to plan for an Alaska, not for 10 years ago, but for 10, 15, 20 years in the future, I think we got some real possibilities of having a positive outcome. The population issue is something we're not going to be able to avoid. It's a real thing. We don't have large families like we once did a generation or two ago. We don't have people moving to Alaska in the numbers they once did, especially during booms like the pipeline. So we're going to have a discussion as to how, once again, what kind of educational systems are we going to have going forward? What kind of an economic system is best going to serve Alaska going forward? So some pretty serious discussions on some pretty big items, but I think Alaska has tremendous opportunity, probably more so than many other states. So we'll let you guys know how things are going. We'll schedule additional press conferences here in the future. So thank you.